Good morning and welcome to Coffee and the Word. The title of today's Coffee and the Word is 3 Things We Can Learn from Noah's Ark, from the story of Noah's Ark. And just to give you a little background, this all starts in a really interesting way. It starts with the Lord saw that the wickedness on the earth had just become unbearable. There's a lot going on. I'm not going to go back into that, but God decides, He determines that the only solution to the problem is to wipe the earth out, just destroy it. In fact, he decides, so the Lord said, verse 7 of Genesis chapter 6, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I've created, with them the animals and the birds and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. And so we're left, if you're reading along, and a lot of people do this, they'll start in Genesis chapter 1 and they'll start doing their new Bible reading plan. And Genesis chapter 1, God creates the heavens and the earth, and it was morning and it was evening the first day, and God saw that man should not be alone, so He gives him a woman, and they are naked and they feel no shame. And then chapter 3, this serpent jumps in the scene and you're like, this isn't good. And you go through that whole scenario, and then Cain kills Abel, and then then this Enoch character shows up and he walks with God, and God took him and he was no more. And then in chapter 6, there's this culmination of everything, and God looks down upon the earth and he says, wow, this wickedness is unbearable. In fact, another verse says the violence was unbearable. And so when we think about this and when we're reading along, it's easy for us, and I said this before, but I want to make sure that you understand this. It's easy for us to read this story and put God on trial. And so my first point in the Noah's Ark narrative is God's ways are not our ways. God's ways are not our ways. And in fact, Isaiah 55 says it just like that. God's ways are not our ways. His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And so I think it's really important for us to, as we're reading through this text, we like to put ourselves on par with God, and we like to be like, well, that's not how I would have handled it. And I think it's important for us to realize that God is more loving than you are. God is more merciful than you are. God is He made this. And so instead of looking at it and saying like, wow, I can't believe a God would wipe out the whole human race, we should be asking our question, how bad must it have been for our God to wipe out the entire human race? And then there's this real interesting little caveat in this narrative. It says in verse 8, it says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And I've talked about this before, but I think it's interesting that God He's determined that it's just, it's done. The violence is unbearable. We're going to have to wipe them out. And then there's this little scripture that says, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And it goes on to say, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. And so God says, okay, Noah and his family, we're gonna start a new covenant with Noah and his family. This is the plan. So we're going to get Noah to build this ark, and he's going to build this ark this exact dimensions. We're going to get 2 of every kind of animal, and he's going to take them on the ark. And because Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, he's no longer going to wipe out all of mankind. He's no longer going to wipe out all of the animals. He's no longer going to do these things. And so this whole idea that our ways, when we put God on trial, is so devastatingly destructive to your mindset. If you'll approach this story with the realization that God's ways are not my ways, His thoughts are not my thoughts, and a realization that all of those are higher, if you could have the mind of God, then He wouldn't be much of a God. And so that's the first thing. The second thing I want to point out is all things are possible with God. The second problem with the Noah narrative that we often run into is like, that can't happen. Like, this one dude can't go and build this ark big enough to hold every kind of animal everywhere, all these things. And I even hear, I hear people of faith who want to make this argument. And, and so they diminish the story, and they're like, there's no way that Noah could have gotten all the animals together. There's just no way. It wouldn't have happened. And you're like, when did you stop believing that God could do anything? Like, when did you, as a Christian, when did you stop believing that God for the impossible things? In fact, the Scripture makes it very clear: with God, all things are possible. That's what Jesus says after he talks about how difficult it is for the rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And he says it's easier for a camel to walk through the eye of a needle. And they say, then who can be saved? And Jesus' answer is, with God, all things are possible. And it's true. Like, when you read this story, whether it is figurative language or whether it is a narrative intended to tell a story or whatever, which I don't believe, for us to ever challenge this story because, well, that couldn't happen, is a diminishment of our faith. Like, God can do it. Like, all things are possible with God. And so that's the second thing I want you to learn. The last thing, the third and final thing that I think we can learn from, at least the third and final thing in this story that we can learn, is Noah was building this ark and everyone thought he was nuts, right? Noah is building this massive ship on dry land and everybody's walking by. What in the world is Noah doing? Oh my good, what? No, it's never flooded here. And I'm afraid that we as Christians sometimes we fail to realize that the world at times is gonna think we are crazy. The world at times is gonna look at our lives and determine that we're nuts. How could you believe that? In fact, that's the narrative right now. How could you believe in a God that fill in the blank? And so I want to encourage you to know that there are going to be many times in your faith journey in which your obedience to God is going to be looked at by the world as foolishness. It's foolishness to the world. But stand firm. Because here's the great news. While you may look the fool now, the floodwaters did come. The waters did rise. And while he looked the fool, while he was walking in faith, when it all became sight, he's the only one who didn't look the fool. And the same is true with us. There's coming a day when the world will stand before God. The Scripture makes it clear. And he's going to divide them, the Scripture says, the sheep from the goats. And I dare suggest that the sheep would have looked foolish until they hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And the goats probably look like the intelligent ones until they heard, depart from me, I never knew you. I think it's important for us to be obedient to God even when people think we're crazy. Because all things are possible with God, and God's ways are not our ways. And so we walk in them in obedience, trusting him for the promises and provisions. I hope this helps. This has been another edition of Coffee and the Word. God bless you.